Hello, everybody, and welcome to one of our panel discussions for the Neurodiverse Museum. This is a part of our programme that is funded through the Art Fund, who have been really supportive in helping us as an organisation to develop the work we do. The panel discussions are very much about us thinking about the ways that the cultural sector and museums work for neurodivergent people, and we try and bring as many different voices and different opinions and expertise into the sessions as we can. So the panel discussion today, we've got some brilliant people with us. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. I'm going to go around my screen. I'm going to start with Charlie, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm Charlie Lawton-Ray. I am a master's student in Museums and Heritage Practice at the University of Chester. I'm autistic and have ADHD, and my work includes considering how archaeological reconstructions can be more accessible and representative of autistic experiences. And I also volunteer extensively for organisations including the National Trust and independent museums.
Thanks, Charlie. Sarah?
Hi everyone. So my name's Sarah McNally. So I work part-time for an arts organisation called Engage, who support the sector in lots of leading visual art. And then I also work part-time as a freelance artist, predominantly working within training around neurodiversity or delivering with neurodiverse young people. And I have ADHD.
Thanks, Sarah. Katie?
Hello everyone, my name's Katie and at the moment I work for Liverpool Biennial, which is an art festival where we activate spaces in art galleries and museums, and I have a lot of my background is in arts and museum organisations working with around youth engagement and participation programmes. And yeah, I've done a lot of work like supporting with the Neurodiversity Arts Festival in Liverpool, and I myself have ADHD and dyspraxia.
Oh, thanks so much, Katie. That's brilliant. It's so good to hear about all the different experiences. And I should introduce myself. So I'm Justine. I'm one of the directors of the Neurodiverse Museum, and was one of the founding directors. I'm also autistic and ADHD. So yeah, there'll be a lot for us to talk about today. So I'm going to start by thinking about where the Neurodiverse Museum comes from and what we're trying to do as an organisation. So we're trying to change the way that the cultural sector think about neurodivergent people and how we work with and for them. And we have three pillars we work to. So access, how people come in and out of our organisations; workforce, thinking about the people who volunteer or work for museums and wider cultural organisations; and representation. So where is neurodivergent voice and lived experience within the collections and the different types of work that we deliver. So there's loads of crossover in those themes in terms of where the barriers are and where the opportunities are, but I really want to pick them apart and try and think about them separately. But I'm sure when we're talking, there'll probably be crossover as we discuss. But first of all, I wanted to think about those barriers to accessing museums and other cultural venues. So I was going to ask the panel, what do you think are those key barriers? What is it that really prevents or makes it really challenging for neurodivergent people to access what we do? Who wants to go first? Sarah.
Thank you. I think there's multiple layers to the answers around these questions, but I think there's so much even pre-existing. So I think in the art sector especially, there's a lot of hidden rules socially. So that's the case in galleries, that's the case in museums. And whilst I think we're getting there a little bit more with signage, we're getting there a little bit more with pre-visitor experiences, pre-visitor information, there's still a lot of convolution around dense signages, dense maps, things like that. And I think there's kind of potentially some misunderstandings there of what's actually needed even before we enter a space, really. So I think there's kind of a few layers to that, and there's that pre-visitor information and that social stories potentially, which I think more organisations are doing a little bit more of, which is a bit more like, this is where you would park, this is where you get into the doors. These are the quiet spaces that are available to you. And I think also there's that sort of front of house information. We often see inclusion as an add-on, like a kind of, does this person need it, therefore it would be part of the information, where we would really need to get into a world where that is just how it is for everyone, and we tell everyone that this is the information. You may need access to this space. We're not going to make any assumptions on how you look, but this is just the information that's there for everyone. So I think there's kind of there's still quite a long way to go in kind of understanding that. Yeah,
Thank you. Does anyone else want to? I will keep talking, so I'm gonna see if anyone else wants to come back first.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, I think yeah, like what's just been said, I think there's lots of layers to the answers, and they're often like intersectional as well. I think ways that things are designed affect, like, I think when you design for one group to be more inclusive, you actually help a lot of other groups as well. But yeah, one thing I've picked up on from working in museums and things is that a lot of training around kind of an inclusive visitor experience and neurodiversity training, it's often aimed at front of house teams, learning and engagement, but I think it really needs to be embedded to teams that are designing from the very beginning. So I think, I think this might vary across the board, but I think rolling out that training to like curatorial teams, so it's thought about in the exhibition planning and in the interpretation, and it's like what's just been said, it's like an add-on at the moment. So I think it's really embedding that. And I think as well, there's again, it's like about the welcome. So I think visual stories are becoming more common, but I think there's a bit of work to be done around, like welcome videos and different ways of accessing that information. And I think there's ways that we can be creative with it as well. I mean, we've been doing a lot of thinking about having almost like community ambassadors, like a trusted person in the community that can bring groups into the venues. And sometimes you actually just need that friend to help you through the door and show you around. And it's, I think a common neurodivergent experience is that anxiety when you don't quite know what to expect or what access provision there's going to be. So I think it's really important to have different ways of engaging and entering things like that. And then again, it's that perception of buildings and perception of expected behaviour, which is often a very neurotypical view. So I think there's a lot of things there. There's a lot of layers. But the final thing as well, I'd just say, is that I think right now in exhibitions, one thing I've picked up on is that it's a lot of the interpretation is very reading heavy. And I think it would be interesting to see a move to different ways people can engage and learn about the artworks. And I think that happens as part of events, but it's not necessarily built into the design already. But yeah, there are a few thoughts from the top of my head already.
Oh, thank you. And before I forget, yeah, so those things that you were talking about in terms of inclusion, we use the word equity. We don't tend to talk about inclusion so much because for exactly those reasons, people just kind of go, oh, well, we've included you, so that's great. But what you were saying, Sarah, about that, I want to be able to access and experience a venue whenever I need to access it or want to access it. I don't want to be told you can do it this time because then it's, a quiet hour. I want to do it when it works for me. And so that equity, I still think there's not that understanding of we're looking for equity. We're not looking for inclusion. Just, you've thought about it. And the things you're saying about training as well, Katie, that I think when we've had the network meetings, what we're noticing a lot, and I see this a lot when we deliver training, that the people who've got the decision-making potentials aren't there. So those people who could put it within policies and make it happen aren't coming to the training and understanding what's happening and hearing neurodivergent lived experience. So it's really difficult to make that culture change within organisations, which then leads to all of the issues that we're seeing. So just off the top of my head, I wanted to remember that. Sorry, Charlie, I'm going to come to you now.
No, it's okay. I know we'll come back to it later in the session, but I think the point that was raised about front of house teams getting all the training also links into support for people in the workforce and people entering the workforce. But I think in terms of barriers, you've got definitely the sense of knowing what to expect and providing all that information up front, as well as the actual experience, I guess, of the museum itself. And I guess it's interesting perhaps to not separate the two, but they are two sides of the same coin. And this is just off the top of my head, but you've got within the museum so many different aspects of information. It's an assemblage of the objects, the text, various forms of media. And often we think of using alternative media as being almost like a form of entertainment. If you think about all these immersive experiences that are doing the rounds at the moment, they are seen as a new way to understand something, but it's often marketed at people who have read all the books or have that existing knowledge anyway. It's not seen as a way of introducing people into a topic for whom they haven't perhaps read up already on something, because that's just not the way they learn. And these experiences aren't just an add-on, something that you would pay extra for. They are just a different way of learning. So I guess that's an interesting thing to consider, and I think that's something that maybe we've moved away from. And I'm not saying obviously don't charge for immersive stuff at all, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider in terms of how are we presenting information in museums within the setting itself, as well as providing the information up front. And how can we cater for those different needs, which is affect everybody who are visitors, not just autistic people, not just the wider neurodivergent community, but people who perhaps don't have English as a first language, or people who are just tired and don't want to read. I guess that'll be another theme, that this isn't just all for people who are neurodivergent, but when you are inclusive and equitable, as you put it, you benefit everybody in museums, including the reputation of the institution, but also ultimately the audiences you serve.
I think that's such an important point, and I think it's come across with what all of you were saying, that need to consider, okay, we're not just doing this just for us, we're doing this for everybody. Because it will automatically, when you think about neurodivergent people, it will automatically support other people as well. And what you said about workforce as well, and we will talk a little bit in a moment about workforce, but if you've not got a representative workforce, then you're not going to have a representative audience, because you're not going to understand what it is that people need. It's so important, and the reason why we have those 3 pillars is because you need all 3 of them to make sure that your organisation is working in the right way. Katie.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, so one of the things I've thought a lot about recently as well is that a lot of best practice when it comes to trauma-informed practice really benefits. Again, when you support one group, you really support everyone, but a lot of trauma-informed practice really benefits neurodivergent visitors in that area of giving choice and giving clarity and like all of those kind of things that you try to embed. But another thing I just wanted to mention was that one thing we've been thinking a lot about within our context at Liverpool Biennial is encouraging artists to include at least one element of creative access into their artworks. So in addition to maybe like your standard interpretation, having an audio guide and think about how you can do that creatively, that's not just the kind of standard thing, but maybe actually it adds another layer of interpretation to what's already there. Or is it something that you can feel and that will tell you something more about the artwork? And it's become a conversation where actually this isn't just about access either. A lot of artists have fed back that thinking about that has made them think about their practice differently and how people can engage with it differently. And it's really added another layer to how they think about their work. And I would find that really interesting to see more in museums as well. How might people experience and learn about an object differently versus hearing a bit more on a tour or reading about it on a text panel? How can we be really innovative about how people can engage with objects and learn about them that makes them more accessible, but also it creates a more dynamic experience as well?
Oh, I mean, it's a brilliant example, isn't it? And it's bringing it to life as well in different ways that we might not have thought of. And I think you were saying, Sarah, about that kind of like huge amount of text that you still see within organizations. And one of the things I'm always trying to say to people when we're training is that actually there's a perception, I think, that it's very expensive to make museums equitable for neurodivergent people, but actually sometimes it's just that thinking process, and some of the things that we can do are quite cheap. You can use a smartphone to just take a pre-visit of your venue that goes, right, this is what's going to happen when you get here. That's fine. I don't need it to be really glossy. I just need to know what's going to happen when I appear. Or a Word document that's got some pictures and photos on it that goes, okay, I can see what happens where I go. But also that sometimes there's an assumption that, and I think this is kind of coming through what you were saying, Charlie, as well, that actually it's all right to just have like the odd thing that's for neurodivergent people, or that it's an art and crafts kind of base or something like that. Whereas actually we want that in-depth knowledge of what is going on in museums and the different types of subject areas and access to curators. And it's really trying to, and this again goes back to what you were saying, Sarah, I think that it's that need to have people's understanding change. Those stereotypes, that understanding of what neurodivergence is not necessarily, I think, what people think it is.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something, Sarah?
Just a few final thoughts from me on that. I think there's a couple of things. I think Kate touched on it. There's a real onus that we need to put on curatorial and on directors and on funding bids, so that we have the capacity and the means to do these things. Because yes, it actually doesn't really need to be really polished, but there's such a heavy weight on learning teams to carry this absolute flame, and to be the people that are constantly carrying the weight of care and constantly advocating for it. And sometimes being the difficult team that are always like, but hold on, we want to think about this. There's this idea that sensory stories, sensory objects, sensory experiences, as Charlie was saying, is novelty. It's for children. It's about engagement. It's about entertainment. It's not about access. So there's these kind of levels to this. But yeah, as you were saying, Justine, it doesn't need to be this expensive thing. It just needs to be ingrained in the project, but ingrained in staff's capacity as well, because especially the neurotypicals in the room shouldn't have to carry the weight of anyone. And I think that's really important that we keep doing that, because otherwise there's this entrenched bias that's going to happen and will continue to happen if access continues to just put on people. But what we need it to do is be ingrained in a way so that it's accessible and it doesn't make other people have to do more work, but essentially it alleviates everyone's capacity. And when I do freelance projects, and Katie was talking about this in a really beautiful way actually, is that inclusion is a practice for me. And I sometimes find it hard to even articulate to people. Everything I do is about inclusion, really, as much, and even when I try and get away from it, I can't, because my advocacy just comes through in a really annoying way. So that's almost my primary goal. And then the secondary is to explore something creative or access a cultural experience. So I think we need to think of inclusion as a practice with our artists, and we need to really hold directors, funding bids, funders accountable for what is, how is it equitable, what have we asked for, and how are we kind of putting that in on the ground. And it's not just the learning team's responsibility.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with all of that. I mean, the funding, oh, crikey, I can't tell you how difficult it's been for us to even access funding as neurodivergent individuals. Incredibly challenging. And we hear that from across the sector. Even accessing funding is difficult. It's almost like you say, it's an add-on. It's not really that important. We're the sector support organisation and the SSN for neurodivergent people in the sector. I thought people would be coming to our door and saying, can you help us? We get it from individual museums who want kind of training, or cultural sector people who kind of realise we need to do stuff, but we do not get it from the people that you would expect to see it from across the sector, which is worrying. And it makes you feel that actually at that level, there's not that understanding of how difficult it is for neurodivergent people working in the sector or accessing the sector. And I think it's really important what you were saying about carrying that load. We definitely see that it's the learning teams and the access teams that are doing the work. The responsibility is often on neurodivergent people to talk about what is happening for, that kind of like, we're having to share so much of ourselves to be able to go, look, this is what's happening, and why you need to change it. And it's in an environment where capacity is limited and we're all working so much, doing so much more, that's challenging. And just trying to say, actually, we just need time sometimes to be able to do this, but that's got to be funded, is a difficult conversation to have. So the more we can advocate and make that shift change, and things like this is how we can help do that. So I'm conscious that we probably need to move on to the next bit, which is linked, but it's something that I think is often forgotten. There's so much focus just on accessibility, that there's not always that focus on, but what does that mean in terms of representation in collections? And I think you were touching on this a little bit as well there, Katie. And both Charlie and Sarah, I know that's within your work as well. And it's so important to be thinking, well, this isn't just about how you come into our venues. It's about making sure you feel like you're represented when you're here and your voice is here. So my next question was going to be, where do you think we are as a sector? What do you think the barriers are, and how do you think we can change it? Which is interesting. We could have a panel discussion just on that, but let's see if we can do it in 10, 15 minutes just to start. Who wants to go first? Katie.
Yeah, so yeah, I touched on the part of actually how we can display objects and make them. I don't feel like interactive is the right word because I think, like others have said, it kind of has those connotations that's novelty, but maybe different ways of engaging with it. But I think also in collecting itself, I think the barrier is that, I think there's some diagnoses that have only really been understood in recent years. I think there's, potentially gaps in where things haven't been collected in the past, but I think there's something about contemporary collecting objects that help tell our stories now that can, these don't have to be historical objects. They can be contemporary objects that still can belong in museums and be part of the stories that we tell. So I think there needs to be active effort put into, I think that needs to be embedded. I think the same way that, we're doing a lot of work thinking about decolonizing collections and thinking about what stories we're not telling. I think that's another part of it. I think we need to think from all angles what stories aren't being told, and what connections can we make as well, between the objects we've got. And I mean, there was a project I did last year where I worked with a group of young people where they were researching objects already in our museums and trying to find hidden or underrepresented or misrepresented stories about them, just from looking, asking questions like, okay, so what period in time does this object relate to, and what was happening during that time, and kind of drawing links, because interpretation is all about which narrative we choose to tell and what lines we draw between things. So I think maybe there's something around interpretation and those contemporary objects that we can kind of build into stories that belong there. But then there was another thing I was thinking about, which is that I think one thing we see a lot in museum work is short-term contracts, a lot of that because of funding. And I think that's a real barrier to creating longer-term changes and longer-term research. And, a lot of exhibitions are in the works 3 to 5 years or maybe more before they happen. And when you get so much staff change, you might have someone that's really invested in making that happen, but then that's really hard to carry forward when there's so much change and turnover. So I think there's lots of barriers, but I think one of them is the staffing problem that we've got, and having the funding to be able to really carry out longer term work, because I think it's a big piece of work that needs to be in every bit of collecting and interpretation and not just one-off projects.
Thanks, Katie. Does anyone want to come back? Charlie?
So this very much links into my work, but I think it's a really interesting question that spans the fact that autism, as you were just touching on, Katie, and I keep saying autism, but that's sort of my area of practice, but it's obviously it's the whole of neurodivergence. It's something that has only really been understood very recently, so we don't have a clearly identifiable history which can be problematic. And what I don't want to do is enter into something that feels pseudoscientific or feels quite conjectural. And we've seen in news stories in recent months how retrospective diagnoses can be completely unhelpful and harmful to neurodivergent communities by just associating traits and random bits of DNA with certain people and certain conditions. But what I also think is interesting is that we have got now a really exciting new field in terms of neurodivergent art. We've got Nina Calley now is a Turner Prize winner. We've got lots of groups that are existing, but also hopefully that will develop and will expand, fingers crossed anyway. And I think there's a real opportunity there to tap into using, not just using art as this is a form of short-term engagement, a means of accessibility, and it gets hung on a gallery wall for 2 weeks because it's seen as something that is, yes, it's a form of engagement, but often these artworks reveal something about people's own experiences. And I've been into galleries where I'm like, this is amazing. And there's been works that convey themes that almost directly correspond to a full, like 6 month temporary exhibition, convey the same themes, but one person is doing work that is actively going to be collected by a museum, and these other people are doing work that is hung up for less than a month, and it gets taken down, and it's a flash, and it doesn't get advertised and gets promoted. There's a need for us to use artwork and use, I guess, perhaps our own experiences, but in conveying them in ways that are exciting, that maybe gets the core of what it's like to be a neurodivergent person in the 21st century. But could you perhaps link that to the past in ways that happen with other groups? We are not, saying this person was neurodivergent, this person was this, but we have, we like to show the past in ways that connect to ourselves. We like to show, the medieval or Roman periods through bustling street scenes, because that is what our 21st century brains connect to, or at least used to before online shopping. So can we have a neurodivergent experience on that? Because there will inevitably have been experiences that, if you're saying that these are similar, then autistic neurodivergent experiences are going to correspond, at least generally, to the feeling of overwhelm. And I'm probably being really vague there, but I know that it's a very big subject, and I don't want to take up any more time on. I'm excited to see what everyone else says.
No, it's got loads of things thinking in my brain, and I think that's brilliant, and absolutely thinking about how do we change that focus of the way that we're represented totally in terms of interpretation and curatorial processes, I think. And Katie, you were touching on that, I think, as well. Katie, do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I completely understand what you were saying, Charlie. I agree. I think kind of links back to what I was saying as well, with there are links we can draw there, even if we don't know things for a fact in history. There's ways that we can talk about stories that just acknowledge that we've always existed, we've always been there in history. And one example, if you're displaying something, talking about the criminal justice system, there are a lot of neurodivergent people that haven't had the support they need, or a kind of overrepresented, or I've forgotten the word I'm looking for, but it's I think disproportionately criminalized for certain things, and that find themselves in prison settings, or that haven't had a diagnosis. That is a really interesting thing, and that's probably been there throughout history. And when you look at how in the past people that were, say, schizophrenic, or having other kind of mental health issues or neurodivergences, they were criminalized, and they were given really awful treatments. And that's not to say that's the only side of the story we should represent, like those negative things, but it's things like that. Like these stories have always existed, even if they didn't have the terminology for it, or even if they didn't have the understanding. And it'd be quite interesting maybe to approach collections in interpretation from a place of curiosity and ask questioning maybe what is on the records and what we know. Um, were these people maybe misrepresented? Were their stories actually accurate? Maybe the way they were recorded back then when we knew less. I think part of that interpretation is about curiosity and questioning things that we know. And I think that can also be part of how we maybe represent those stories and respect them.
Oh, totally. And I think, and I wonder about your thoughts on this as well, that some of this is about that misunderstanding and still that I can't think of the word now either, that kind of mistrust of what it is to be neurodivergent, and people not really, they're kind of like, oh well, I don't see what your problem is, you kind of look like you could, there's that kind of like feel that I still see. And you see it across the education sector, and when you're talking again about the criminal justice system, but we see so many issues around how neurodivergent people are able to access education or access the health system. Those things will have existed and prevent people from accessing all of the different services that neurotypical people are able to access. Those stories are there. They're there contemporary, and they will have been there in the past, or there's we can make it an accurate assumption that they will have been. So I think there's definitely something around how do we do that. But yeah, I wanted to ask, do you feel like it could be, and again, it's going back to Sarah, I think what you were saying at the beginning, again, that belief and that understanding of neurodivergence generally within the wider population about what they think about us. They've been taught it since school, that these people are over here and you're over here. And then that perpetuates out into society. And so we're seeing it within our collections and our collecting policies and the way we deliver, even though we know that predominantly within the museum and cultural workforce that there is a higher proportion of neurodivergent people. So yeah, lots of different things to think about. And the diagnosis thing as well, the fact that it's, so relevant to be self-diagnosed because it's a privilege to get a diagnosis. It's so difficult. And we know all those challenges that happen around that. So yeah, Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, there's been loads said, and I think for people watching, it's really important that they come away with sort of tangibles, I guess, in my mind. But I think, again, there's that onus with curatorial about how we kind of dictate collections, what Katie's been saying and Charlie about that kind of interpretation, but also, broadening it out. But I think ultimately we really need to cultivate safe language to do that. So broaden it out around non-normative experiences, so non-neuronormative experiences, such as Kate was saying, there may be like mental health things. There's an umbrella term of neurodiversity that may link more to challenges, the nervous system, things that we may tangibly have in terms of information of that artist. We may not know a diagnosis or the challenges they were going through, but we can see links to nervous system. We can see links to triggers and glimmers and things around them, or privilege or challenges. And when we start to cultivate that safe language, then conversations will come up naturally, because people will say, well, I can relate to that in this context. And there's also that danger of when we, for want of a better term, roll out a neurodiverse artist and kind of all gather around that concept, because I think we also need to do that really safely, so that there's not this sense of it's a novelty or it's something that we are all coming to the stage of at a set time and place, but something that we understand is a daily practice and a daily challenge for people who are dealing with the spectrum. And that the broadness of that, I think, especially around, and this is quite specific, but especially around those that are really high functioning on the spectrum as well, because I think they start to get kind of put into a very different category for those that aren't. So there's kind of an expectation of like, well, this isn't for them audiences, this is for the audience that may come with a carer or may come in this context. So we have to kind of understand the challenges are there as a percentage for everyone on the spectrum, and then percentages will almost be environmentally increased and decreased. So I think there's so much work to be done on that. But I think ultimately what Charlie and Katie have hit on is the cultivating safe approaches to do that. Maybe a very collaborative things within your organisation. So therefore the interpretation doesn't just lie in one team, and the team that have all that information on access and inclusion aren't just given that and then have to interpret that and give that to an artist or give that to the outreach team. So I think there's sort of more to be done on how teams work together internally, and ensuring again that the funding, especially when we're getting project bids, which a lot of people are doing more of, puts that in place, that part of this bid is that we will work more closely with curatorial, and we'll allow staff time for that. We'll allow kind of, and there kind of needs to be some more mutual benefits for people who are working seriously at capacity. But I think, as Charlie was saying, there's ways to interpret them stories and bring them stories in without necessarily even saying, this is about neurodiversity, but this is actually around the neurodiversity paradigm, the symptoms, the triggers, the nervous system, the mental health challenges that may sit alongside of it. And also, and this is something that people need to sort of speak more freely about, there's a comorbidity with physical health. So often those on the spectrum will suffer from other conditions that might be hypermobility, it might be POTS, it might be chronic fatigue, but there will be comorbidity with other conditions very frequently because of genetic reasons for that. So I think there has to be an understanding that this goes well beyond a story or an informed practice, but more into a health and a lifestyle and a limitation. So I think there's plenty we can find in the past that already speaks to that, health conditions, challenges. And I think it's about trying to find that commonality more freely and safely, and cultivating a language in which we can do that within.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, agree with everything that you guys are saying there. And I think it comes down to that fact that we're about stories, and we're about representing human experience. At this moment in time, that isn't happening for quite a large proportion of the population, and there are no real reasons why that should be happening. Because there's a lot of us here talking about the ways and the opportunities for that to change. So it gives me a lot of heart to listen to you, and lots of other things that you're helping me think about as well. So yeah, it's great. And I'm conscious of time, so we're going to move on to the final part of our discussion, which is about workforce. And the barriers to neurodivergent people working in museums and the cultural sector. And again, we've kind of touched on them little bits as we've gone through, but what do you feel? I mean, and yourselves, how does it feel in terms of, being a neurodivergent person working in the museum sector or the cultural sector? And what do you think are those kind of key barriers and things that we could do practically to change that and make it, a more equitable experience? I don't know who would like to go first. Katie.
Yeah, I mean, this could be a whole conference. Never mind its own panel discussion. I'll straight off the bat say one thing that just I think keeps coming up for me, and in various settings. I think when we talk about inclusion work generally, or and I say inclusion intentionally because what you said about equity, I think this really doesn't exactly work for that. So I think often when we talk about support for neurodivergent people getting into work or progressing in their career, and this really goes for, to be honest, any group that is underrepresented in the workforce. There's a lot of emphasis around the support for that individual, and I just think that's really helpful, but can't happen on its own because you can't out-mentor systemic barriers. And there seems to be a lot more emphasis on the individual and helping them act different and helping them navigate the challenges, and not so much on removing those barriers in the first place. And I think that is a really big thing that needs to change. So, when we're thinking about supporting people in the workforce, why don't we shift it to, this kind of goes back to what we've been saying about really the people that make the decisions, but we need to be thinking differently about how we advertise roles. Does that mean having hands-on open days where people can actually learn about what the roles are and demystify them, casually speak to people that are in the roles? And because not everyone, I keep talking about how when you support one group, you support others, but I talk a lot about kind of working class inclusion as well. And I think, you wouldn't necessarily, one thing I've struggled with in my career is not necessarily having the language that I need to articulate myself. And that's because of that, and also because of neurodivergence, and not having the connections to really understand what a job is and what someone does and what's available, and then also kind of trying to unpack a job description that's full of jargon and things that you wouldn't necessarily understand if you're not in that world already. So I think we need to shift the focus, I think, away from individuals, move it to more that social model of disability in this thinking, and look at how we can, really make that different from the start. And I mean, there's been some improvements. I've seen it become a more common practice where, interviews are shared in advance, interview questions, and people are encouraged to apply in different ways. But that feels like it's quite entry level. It feels like the bare minimum in some ways. And I think actually it needs to go a lot deeper than that. We need to be, I think, resourcing organisations to be able to work differently and think differently, and in some ways maybe be more radical and transform how they, recruit for their workforce and how they support staff. Because actually museums are really great places to work, and I think there's in one of the things where I supported the Neurodiversity Arts Festival, neurodivergent people are overrepresented in creative roles because that is a real strength that we've got in a lot of ways. And I think that's a real thing to highlight, but people can only sustain those careers if they're supported right and if the workplaces are right. And then the last thing I'll say on that as well is I think access riders, I think there's a lot of good practice we can be doing there, being proactive rather than reactive to things. So, when you're recruiting for staff or freelancers or volunteers, sharing that as standard with everyone, because even if they're not disabled or neurodivergent, they can, maybe talk about their caring responsibilities. They can talk about language barriers. It's just a proactive way of learning how to support people and meet their access needs. So, I mean, there's probably a million things I've said there and a million more I could say, but they're the ones that just keep coming up for me.
Oh, I mean, social model of disability, yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're talking about in terms of the shifts to interview practice, you're right. Some people are starting to think about that, but that is a tiny, tiny proportion from what I see. Even I still get people saying, but I can't give the interview questions because it wouldn't be fair. Like, what do you mean? Just give them to everybody then if you don't want to give it to just like the neurodivergent people.
I also
But
just want to add one more thing on that,
Go on.
actually.
Yeah,
I
go
mean,
on.
I've had that same feedback before when I've asked, not everywhere gets it yet. And again, it goes back to that training. But it's even, I think recruitment panels really need to be trained in unconscious bias. I know they do it sometimes, but I've had feedback from an interview before where they said I didn't make enough eye contact, and that made it feel hard for them to engage with me. And that's after I already disclosed, things. So again, I think there's a lot of learning that needs to be done in that area as well.
I mean, that's, yeah, I am not very good at eye contact. And I remember teaching myself to have eye contact, specifically because someone said I'd never get a job if I didn't. And that was the only reason. I was thinking about 18. But I think this goes back to that wider issue around understanding neurodivergent experience and making assumptions about neurodivergent people. If that's still underpinning and there's still that belief that, well, they want extra things and they're, why can't they do these? If that's still there, then trying to get people to change their mindset to understand that actually what you're doing is excluding neurodivergent people from being part of your workforce, then you trying to get them to then put that and apply that into new ways of recruitment, we're so far away yet, because they just, I see it so frequently where they're just not, I don't have that ability to think by doing this and by sticking to these rigid things like presentations. I'm forever saying to somebody, do you need somebody in that role who can think on their feet and answer a question on their feet and then deliver a presentation about this thing? Do you need that? No. So why are you putting that as part of your recruitment process? Okay.
Sorry, yeah, I have one last thing to add on that as well. Yeah, exactly as you said, I liken it a lot to back in school when we talk about exams versus coursework. That is exactly what that system feels like to me. But yeah, the final thing I wanted to say was that sorry, I'm bringing my notes up because I've got so many thoughts on this. Access to work as well. I think one of the problems I spoke about before with fixed term contracts and short term contracts, we see that a lot in the sector. They don't match up with the access to work delays that we're seeing. So you can have someone start and do an access to work request as soon as they're offered a role or on day one or however far in. They shouldn't need to do it that early. They should be able to see what they actually potentially need. But people are starting and finishing contracts and they're still on the waiting list. They're going entire roles and projects without getting support. So I think that's another layer of the problem. So yeah, as I've talked about the kind of systemic stuff, but on an individual level as well, where people do need focused support, I think those delays are also a really big problem because it's stopping people on fixed term contracts getting any help while they're actually in the roles.
We'll do a specific thing on workforce at some point. There is so much to talk about. I could carry on, but I'm going to stop and ask Charlie or Sarah. Do you want to add anything, Charlie?
I'm happy to go. This is definitely something that I'm thinking about a lot because I'm early career. I'm considering jobs, have applied the role sort of across heritage and archaeology, and it's it's definitely, like what you were saying, Katie, a case of there being so many things that are, I think, just good inclusive practice that you can implement. And these are in some ways very basic things. Like, don't say you're going to, make bold change and rewire your organization if you are not considering these things, at least considering them, and making clear your reasoning. Like, even things, and whenever I say stuff particularly about recruitment, I'm very aware that a lot of museums don't have a lot of time when they're recruiting. There's issues of resources, but where you can, it's things like providing notice when someone hasn't made the next stage of a recruitment process. I feel like that's so basic and yet it doesn't happen. Being prompt and clear with your communication, replying to requests for feedback. I've waited weeks, I've asked for feedback and waited weeks and weeks and weeks, and then to say, I'm autistic, I would really like this feedback because I do not know why I didn't reach interview stage. And I shouldn't have had to have done that. This shouldn't have been something linked to my autism. This should have just been a case of, oh, there's feedback, oh, yes, or, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have the capacity, but just be clear. Like, I mean, I don't think any museums really do aptitude tests, but I feel like they are a complete and utter no really for neurodivergent people. They are so riddled with inaccuracies and assumptions that people will be amazing at one thing at one thing, that it will um override any deficits in other skills that these sort of online, often AI powered aptitude tests are measuring. But yeah, I think it's focus on those basics first, because they will ensure that you have, at the very least, more neurodivergent people applying, feeling comfortable around your company, and that is a good baseline from which to then go forward, and create more systemic change, focusing on, as you were saying, access to work, because at the moment it's a case of I'm applying for stuff when I can, but it's either you don't quite know what the expectation is, whether things are linked into internal hiring or not, whether things are linked into more or less experience, and it's very unclear. And I think that clarity is something that I understand why museums maybe fudge it a little bit, or maybe don't provide clear enough information about rejection, etc. But these are things that do cause an impact and do cause frustration and do cause people ultimately to give up and not enter the sector, which is a massive shame, and is a real cause of talent not accessing or thriving in the sector.
Thanks, Charlie. Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, I think there were some really valid points raised. Charlie talking about the clarity of language, Charlie talking about the early career stuff. Again, as a sector, what do we do to support that early career? What do we do to demystify these careers? That's really important. Kate was talking a little bit about career fairs or days and things like that, but also thinking about that in terms of mission. Are we doing that as part of our mission of the museum, of the gallery? Is that part of our, do we do that as part of our advocacy? Obviously, in this sector, there's value-led practice, there's that purpose, that's call to action, which brings a lot of neurodiversity in. But then we run on very specific project wheels, which also increases that burnout. Very different to neurotypical burnout, which is still very real, but the autistic shutdown is very different to a neurotypical burnout. But again, if we want that staff retention, if we don't want them sick leaves, which, you know, we've got high numbers of sick leave in the sector, what are we doing? And again, neuro-affirming spaces are really about well-being for everyone. And again, there's also a call out that I'd ask people to do. You know, if we're hearing things like, well, aren't we all a bit on the spectrum? Call it out. If we are not understanding it, not in a horrendous way, but in a way that we need to cultivate a language around that. But what I would ultimately say is it's not on a line manager to just, as Kate was saying, have this co-relationship with someone. And it'd be great because that line manager understands it, or because Katie knows what she needs as a neurodiverse person. That's not how this works. We need policy. We need safe policy to protect all of us. And we don't really want to be in a world where people are self-leading what they think they need, because there's so many problems with that. And it causes inequity in the team. It also causes early career people to come in with lots of opinions that might prevent their learning and might prevent their progression. So then maybe you've got someone in the team that can mentor and can offer that extra early career support, but that's really dynamics of your team and of your skill. So we really want policy. We really want better understanding of health and holistic health, and that translating into policy, so that we're cultivating neuro-affirming spaces that also are really great for everyone else's well-being. Because the reality is, lots of people with childcare responsibilities and pulls in lots of other directions may well benefit from a broader working from home policy in a different way, in a completely different way. But they'll benefit from a broader working from home policy, or a more flexible understanding, or a more flexible ticket to a museum where if something overwhelm hits, you can come back on a different day on the same ticket. Or if that might be, and for people on the spectrum, that might be their own brain, but for people who aren't on the spectrum, that might be their toddler. But whatever it is, that flexible ticketing helps us to kind of, you know, want to reinvest and want to come back and ensure that. And also we need to stop separating up staff and visitors as these two different things completely. And how we treat visitors is like this understanding, and how we treat staff is completely different. But again, it's not that onus on just a learning manager to try and hold the weight of everyone, or one good manager. And I, you know, 10 years ago or longer when in the sector, I was like, oh, I did really well there because that one manager really understood it, but not there because I didn't quite understand how to say that. So again, I had this confusing understanding, because actually the sector can be very flexible, can be very kind, but it also runs on this hamster wheel of funding, and our priorities shift. So I think we really need to understand project pauses, programming pauses, staff needs, neuroaffirmity, and then that leaking into well-being as a whole, and therefore the kind of sector retention being, you know, better, because ultimately we're not here for pay, because we know that doesn't exist very high. We're here for passion. So let's soothe that passion, feed that passion, nourish that passion, and then let that play out into how wonderful the sector can be and the magic that we can find.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a brilliant way to end this panel discussion, that kind of that demonstration that what neurodivergent people can bring to the museum sector is so much passion, knowledge, understanding, creativity. Without us, it's not a resilient sector. But at this moment in time, we're a long way away from achieving that. And I just really want to thank you all for your time and your input. And I will come and harass you all to take part in other things going forward. So this has been the Neurodiverse Museum panel session. We're going to put up the end screen, and then anything that you want from the Neurodiverse Museum, come and find us, join our networks, join any of our training, and we will support you going forward and hopefully see a change through the sector. Thank you, everybody.